The sound of a silver stylus scratching against a piece of rough, handmade paper is a quiet thing, a rhythmic, soothing whisper that has echoed through the centuries from a small stone house in the hills of Tuscany. In the mid-15th century, specifically on a quiet Saturday in April of the year 1452, a child was born who would eventually look at the world with more clarity and wonder than perhaps any human before or since. He was born in the village of Vinci, a place where the air smells of pressed olives and damp earth, and where the horizon is defined by the soft undulating curves of the Monte Albano mountains. This landscape was his first teacher, a vast open-air classroom where the young Leonardo spent his days wandering alone, his eyes tracing the intricate patterns of the natural world with a focus that bordered on the meditative. Even as a small boy, he was captivated by the way a stream would curl around a pebble, creating tiny, liquid spirals that vanished as quickly as they appeared, or the way the light would filter through the silver-green leaves of an olive grove, shifting and dancing with the slightest breath of wind. The Tuscany of Leonardo's youth was a place of profound stillness and ancient rhythms. Life moved at the speed of a walking horse or the slow ripening of a vineyard under the Italian sun. There was no formal, rigid schooling for a boy born out of wedlock in those days, and so Leonardo was spared the dusty, repetitive recitations of the traditional Latin academies. Instead, he became what he would later call a disciple of experience, a self-taught observer who believed that nature itself was the only true authority. He would sit for hours by the banks of the Arno River, watching the water currents, noting how the surface tension held together, and how the eddies formed complex mathematical shapes in the dark pools. He didn't just see water, he saw the hidden forces of the earth in motion, a constant flow of energy that connected the mountains to the sea. He carried this curiosity into the woods, where he would study the structure of a dragonfly's wing, or the way a bird would tilt its feathers to catch an updraft, his mind already beginning to map the invisible laws of physics that governed the flight of living things. As the years passed and the young boy grew into a thoughtful teenager, his notebooks began to fill with sketches that were far more than mere drawings. They were attempts to decode the very mechanics of existence. It is a peaceful thought to imagine him sitting on a grassy slope, the sun warming his back as he carefully rendered the anatomy of a wildflower with the same precision a watchmaker might use for a delicate gear. But before we journey deeper into the life of this extraordinary man, I hope you are finding a sense of peace as you settle in for the night. You are here with us at the Slumber archives, where we share new history narrations just like this one every single day to help you drift into a deep and restful sleep. If you find these stories comforting, you might consider subscribing so you never miss a nightly journey, and a simple like on this video helps others find our quiet corner of the world as well. Now let us return to those golden hills of Tuscany, where the young Leonardo was preparing to leave his childhood home behind. The transition from the quiet, rural life of Vinci to the bustling, vibrant streets of Florence was a pivot point that would change the course of history. Florence in the late 1400s was a city of fire and gold, a place where the air hummed with the sound of hammers on stone and the voices of merchants trading silks and spices from across the known world. It was a city waking up from a long historical slumber, rediscovering the wisdom of the ancients and draping it in the colours of the modern age. When Leonardo arrived there as a young apprentice, the sheer scale of human ambition must have been overwhelming. The great dome of the cathedral, engineered by Brunelleschi, rose above the rooftops like a man-made mountain, a testament to what could be achieved when mathematics and art were allowed to merge into one. He was apprenticed to the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, a master who was as much a scientist and engineer as he was a painter. In this environment, the young Leonardo found a kinship he had never known in the lonely hills of his youth. The workshop was a place of constant experimentation, a laboratory where one might find a sculptor working on a bronze statue in one corner, while in another a group of scholars debated the properties of light and shadow. Leonardo moved through this space with a quiet feline grace, soaking up every scrap of knowledge like a sponge. He learned the chemistry of pigments, the way minerals could be ground into dust and mixed with oil to create colors that seemed to glow from within. He learned the geometry of perspective, discovering how to trick the human eye into seeing depth on a flat surface, creating windows into worlds that didn't exist. And yet, despite the noise and the brilliance of the city, he never lost that foundational connection to the natural world he had formed in Vinci. Even in the heart of Florence, he would find himself distracted by the way the shadow of a building fell across a cobblestone street, or the way the muscles in a horse's neck rippled as it pulled a heavy cart. He began to realize that everything in the universe was connected by a series of invisible threads, that the veins in a human arm were mirrored by the branches of a tree, and that the movement of the wind was governed by the same laws as the movement of the blood. This holistic view of the world was his greatest gift. While others saw separate disciplines like art, anatomy, and engineering, Leonardo saw a single, unified tapestry of existence. His early years in Florence were marked by a sense of restless wonder. He would often walk through the markets, not to buy goods, but to study the faces of the people he passed. He was fascinated by the way an emotion could transform a person's features, how a moment of joy or a flicker of sorrow could change the tension in the jaw or the curve of an eyebrow. He would follow people for hours, sketching their expressions in a small notebook he kept tucked into his belt, trying to capture the elusive motions of the mind. To Leonardo, a portrait was not just a likeness of a face, but a map of a soul, a record of a human life frozen in a single quiet moment of reflection. As he worked alongside Verrocchio, it became clear that the student was quickly surpassing the master. There is a famous story that when Leonardo painted a small angel in the corner of one of Verrocchio's large commissions, the elder artist was so moved by the ethereal beauty and the soft, smoky transitions of the light that he resolved to never paint again, realizing that a new kind of genius had arrived. This technique, which Leonardo called sfumato, a word meaning gone up in smoke, allowed him to blur the edges of his subjects, making them appear as though they were breathing, existing within a real atmospheric space rather than being cut out against a background. It was a revolutionary way of seeing, a rejection of the harsh, certain lines of the past in favor of the beautiful ambiguity of reality. The Tuscan landscape remained a constant presence in his mind's eye, even as he moved deeper into the sophisticated circles of the Medici family and the high society of the Renaissance. Whenever he painted a background, he would return to the jagged peaks and the winding rivers of his childhood, painting them with a misty, blue-toned perspective that made them feel ancient and eternal. He understood that the earth was a living body, with the rivers acting as its blood and the rocks as its bones. This deep spiritual respect for the planet gave his work a weight and a presence that was entirely new. As the sun of the early Renaissance rose higher, Leonardo stood at the center of it all, a man who belonged to no single craft, but to the world itself. He was a musician who played a silver lyre of his own design, a singer with a voice that could hush a crowded room, and a philosopher who found God in the geometry of a seashell. But beneath the fame and the growing list of commissions, he remained that same curious boy from the hills of Vinci, a soul who simply wanted to understand why things were the way they were. And so, with his notebooks tucked under his arm and his mind drifting between the mechanics of a bird's flight and the divine proportions of the human form, he prepared to leave the familiar streets of Florence for the grand courts of Milan, where his genius would truly begin to take flight, soaring across the landscape of human knowledge like the very birds he had watched so intently in the quiet valleys of his youth. The air in the heart of Florence during the late 1460s carries the scent of wood smoke, linseed oil, and the sharp metallic tang of hot bronze being poured into clay molds. It is a city that never truly sleeps, a place where the rhythmic hammering of the goldsmiths provides a steady heartbeat for the narrow, winding streets. Into this vibrant sensory world, a young Leonardo arrives, his eyes wide with a quiet, observant intensity that sets him apart from the other boys of his age. He's barely 14 years old when his father, Ser Piero, recognizes that the sketches filling his son's papers are not merely the idle scribblings of a child, but the early whispers of a profound talent. With a heavy portfolio in hand, he brings the boy to the bottega, or workshop, of Andrea del Verrocchio, a man whose name was synonymous with the very soul of the Florentine Renaissance. Verrocchio's workshop is not a quiet sanctuary of solitary art, but a bustling, multidisciplinary laboratory, where the boundaries between craft and science are perpetually blurred. To enter this space is to step into a world of constant motion and intellectual curiosity. It is a place of organized chaos, where the floor is dusted with marble chips and the shelves are lined with anatomical sketches, architectural plans, and jars of pigments ground from rare minerals and exotic plants. Here, Leonardo is not just a student of painting, he is an initiate into the mysteries of the physical world. He begins his journey at the very bottom of the hierarchy, sweeping the dusty floors and grinding pigments into fine powders, learning the chemistry of color by feeling the grit of the earth between his fingers. He learns how to prepare wooden panels with layers of gesso, smoothing the surface until it is as soft as silk, and how to stretch canvas so it rings like a drum when tapped. As the months turn into years, the young apprentice begins to master the technical crafts that define the era. Under Verrocchio's stern but brilliant guidance, Leonardo dives into the complexities of metallurgy and drafting. He watches as massive clay statues are encased in wax and then melted away to make room for molten bronze, a process that requires a delicate understanding of heat, pressure, and the behavior of metals. He learns the mathematics of perspective, using strings and wooden frames to map out the way light recedes into the distance, creating the illusion of depth on a flat surface. This period of his life is a continuous feast for the senses. The heat of the forge, the smell of turpentine, the cold touch of marble, and the scratch of a silver point nib on prepared paper. Each task, no matter how menial, is a lesson in the underlying structure of reality. It is during this time that the legend of the outshone master begins to take shape, centered around a single transformative work, the baptism of Christ. Verrocchio, burdened with numerous commissions from the city's elite, asks his young pupil to finish a specific portion of the large altarpiece. Leonardo is tasked with painting the figure of a kneeling angel on the far left of the composition. As he dips his brush into the oils, a medium still relatively new and experimental in Italy, he does something that changes the course of art history. While the rest of the painting is executed in the traditional, crisp style of tempera, Leonardo's angel is infused with a soft, ethereal glow. The light seems to emanate from within the skin, and the folds of the angel's robes fall with a fluid, natural grace that defies the rigid conventions of the time. The landscape behind the angel, too, is touched by his hand, dissolving into a misty, atmospheric blue that suggests the vastness of the world beyond the frame. The story goes that when Verrocchio saw the finished angel, he was so struck by its beauty and the sheer technical superiority of his student that he resolved never to touch a paintbrush again, choosing instead to focus his remaining years on sculpture. Whether this is historical fact or a poetic exaggeration, it captures a fundamental truth. The student had not only learned from the master, but had glimpsed a future that the master could not yet see. Leonardo was beginning to understand that light does not simply hit an object. It wraps around it, softening the edges and creating a sense of living, breathing presence. This was the birth of sfumato, that smoky, hazy technique that would become his signature, allowing him to capture the subtle nuances of the human soul. But the workshop was more than just a place of manual labor. It was a gateway to the vibrant intellectual culture of the Medici circle. Beyond the walls of the bottega, Florence was a city of ideas, where philosophers, poets, and scientists gathered under the patronage of Lorenzo the Magnificent. In the evenings, the conversation would shift from the mechanics of a pulley to the rediscovered texts of ancient Greece. Leonardo, though he often described himself as an unlettered man because he lacked a formal education in Latin and Greek, was a sponge for this knowledge. He listened to the debates about the nature of the universe and the relationship between the macrocosm of the world and the microcosm of the human body. He saw how the Medici family used art not just for decoration, but as a language of power and a celebration of human potential. This atmosphere of intellectual ferment encouraged him to look beyond the canvas. He began to see the world as a giant machine, governed by laws that could be discovered through observation and recorded in his notebooks. He spent hours in the markets, not to buy goods, but to watch the way people moved, the way a smile would ripple across a face or how anger would tighten the muscles of a neck. He followed the flow of the Arno River, sketching the eddies and whirlpools, trying to understand the mathematical patterns of moving water. In the workshop, he was learning how to make things. In the streets and salons of Florence, he was learning why things were made. As he moved through his 20s, Leonardo became a familiar figure in the city, a tall, handsome young man with long golden hair and a gentle demeanor. He was known for his beautiful singing voice and his ability to improvise music on the lyre, often entertaining the very patrons who would later commission his masterpieces. Yet beneath this charming exterior was a mind that never found rest. He was constantly distracted by new curiosities, a trait that would frustrate his employers for decades to come. A commission for a painting might lead him to spend weeks studying the anatomy of a horse's leg or the optics of how a shadow falls upon a curved surface. To Leonardo, these were not distractions. They were essential components of the whole. To paint a tree, one had to understand the sap that rose through its trunk. To paint a man, one had to understand the bones that held him upright and the thoughts that moved his spirit. The bottega of Verrocchio was the crucible where this multifaceted genius was forged. It provided him with the tools of a craftsman and the mind of a scientist, all while surrounding him with the beauty of the Italian Renaissance at its peak. He learned the value of collaboration, working alongside other future masters like Botticelli and Perugino, sharing ideas and techniques in a spirit of competitive excellence. The air in the workshop was thick with the possibility of discovery. Every new pigment, every new mathematical theorem, every new anatomical observation was a step toward a more perfect understanding of creation. As the sun sets over the Arno, casting long amber shadows across the terracotta roofs of the city, we can imagine Leonardo standing by a window in the workshop. He might be looking out at the distant hills, his mind already drifting away from the unfinished panel on his easel. He is thinking of the wind, of the way it carries the scent of the Tuscan pines, and the way it lifts the wings of a hawk circling above the valley. He is no longer just an apprentice, he is a seeker of truths, a man for whom the act of seeing is the highest form of prayer. The lessons of Verrocchio have been mastered, and the boundaries of Florence are beginning to feel small. The world is vast, and its secrets are waiting to be uncovered by a hand that can draw the soul and a mind that can measure the stars. In the year 1482, a heavy bronze-stringed lute, shaped curiously like the skull of a horse, travelled in the luggage of a 30-year-old man riding north toward the city of Milan. This instrument, crafted by Leonardo's own hand, was a gift to Ludovico Sforza, the powerful duke known as Il Moro, but it served as much more than a musical offering. It was a key to a new life. Leonardo left the familiar hills of Tuscany behind, trading the soft light of the Arno for the fog-laden plains of Lombardy, seeking a patron who could match the scale of his burgeoning ambitions. Before his arrival, Leonardo had composed a letter to the Duke, a document that remains one of the most remarkable resumes in human history. In a steady, confident hand, he did not lead with his ability to paint or carve, but rather with his prowess as an engineer of war. He described portable bridges, armoured vehicles, and cannons capable of flinging stones like a storm. He spoke of secret tunnels and ships that could withstand any fire. Only at the very end, almost as an afterthought, did he mention that in times of peace he could execute sculpture in marble, bronze, or clay, and that in painting he could do as much as any other, be he who he may. It was a bold declaration of a mind that saw no boundary between the destructive power of a siege engine and the delicate grace of a brushstroke. Upon entering the Sforza court, Leonardo found himself in a world of glittering surfaces and constant motion. The Duke required more than just art. He required a master of ceremonies, a man who could turn the dark stone of the Castello Sforzesco into a realm of myth and wonder. Leonardo became the architect of dreams, designing elaborate theatrical spectacles that left the nobility breathless. He spent weeks perfecting the mechanics of stage machinery, creating hidden trapdoors and pulleys that allowed actors to descend from the rafters like gods descending from the heavens. Imagine the air in the great hall, thick with the scent of beeswax candles and expensive perfumes, as Leonardo's paradise began. He constructed a vast, rotating celestial sphere, lined with flickering lamps to represent the stars, and as the music of the lutes filled the room, the planets began to move in their orbits, a silent, mechanical ballet that mimicked the harmony of the universe. To Leonardo, these entertainments were not mere distractions. They were experiments in motion and light, opportunities to observe how a silk curtain drapes when caught by a sudden breeze, or how the glow of a torch softens the features of a laughing face. As he moved through the bustling corridors of the court, he began to carry a small leather notebook tucked into his belt, a habit that would define the rest of his life. These pages, initially filled with sketches for stage costumes and festive decorations, soon began to swell with the weight of a different kind of curiosity. He started to look past the velvet and the gold, turning his gaze toward the fundamental clockwork of the natural world. In the quiet hours of the Milanese nights, by the low light of a single lamp, he began to record his observations on the growth of plants, the flow of water, and the complex architecture of the human frame. He would walk through the markets of Milan, stopping to buy caged birds, just so he could release them, watching with an intense, unblinking focus as their wings unfurled and beat against the air. He wanted to understand the mechanics of flight, not just to paint it, but to master the very air itself. His notebooks became a labyrinth of ideas. A sketch of a lily's petal might sit beside a diagram of a hydraulic pump, and a study of the human shoulder might be interrupted by a recipe for a new kind of pigment. To Leonardo, everything was connected. The veins of a leaf were like the rivers that carved through the Lombardy plains, and the pulse in a man's wrist was governed by the same laws that moved the tides of the sea. It was during this time that he began his first serious investigations into the science of optics. He spent hours observing how light behaves when it passes through water, or how it bends around the edge of a curved surface. He realized that the world is not made of sharp lines and hard edges, but of subtle gradations of shadow, a technique he called sfumato, the smoky blurring of boundaries that allows a figure to emerge from the darkness as if breathing. He wrote that light and shade should blend without lines or borders in the manner of smoke, and in doing so, he began to capture the very atmosphere of the world, the invisible veil that hangs between the eye and the object. Meanwhile, the Duke had a grander task in mind for his resident genius, a project intended to immortalize the Sforza name forever. He commissioned Leonardo to create a bronze equestrian monument of his father, Francesco Sforza, a statue so massive, so daring, that it would be known simply as Il Cavallo, the horse. Leonardo threw himself into the work with a singular obsession. He filled pages with drawings of horses in the ducal stables, capturing the ripple of muscle beneath the skin and the wild, nervous energy of a rearing stallion. He studied their anatomy with the precision of a surgeon, measuring their proportions and observing their movements until he knew the animal better than any groom or soldier. The conceptualization of the Sforza horse was a feat of engineering that pushed the limits of the 15th century. Leonardo envisioned a bronze cast 24 feet high, requiring 70 tons of metal to be poured in a single continuous flow. He designed a complex system of molds and pits, calculating the cooling rates and the structural integrity needed to support such a colossal weight. For years, a full-scale clay model of the horse stood in a courtyard of the castle, a magnificent silent beast that drew pilgrims and artists from across Europe just to marvel at its grace. It was a symbol of Leonardo's belief that man could rival the creative power of nature itself, given enough time and enough thought. But time was a fluid thing for Leonardo. While the Duke grew impatient for his monument, Leonardo's mind continued to drift toward the mysteries of the earth. He began to explore the mountains north of the city, finding fossilized shells embedded in the high rock faces. He wondered how the remains of sea creatures could find their way to the peaks of the Alps, and he began to formulate theories about the ancient history of the planet, sensing that the earth was far older than the scriptures suggested. He watched the way mountain streams carved through stone, noting that water is the driving force of all nature, and he began to dream of taming the rivers of Lombardy with a system of canals and locks. His scientific inquiry was never separate from his art. It was the foundation of it. To paint a hand, he felt he must understand the bones and tendons that moved it. To paint a storm, he must understand the pressure of the wind and the weight of the clouds. He was a man possessed by the why of things. Why do we sneeze? Why is the sky blue? Why does a flame flicker in a draught? Each question led to another, creating a web of knowledge that stretched across every discipline imaginable. As the years in Milan stretched on, the clay model of the great horse remained, waiting for the bronze that would never come, as the metal was diverted to make cannons for the defense of the city. Yet, for Leonardo, the process was often more vital than the result. The thousands of pages of notes he was accumulating were a testament to a mind that could not be satisfied with mere appearances. He was peeling back the skin of the world, looking for the underlying geometry, the hidden patterns that govern the dance of the universe. The court of Ludovico Sforza provided the stage, but Leonardo was the one who built the scenery, lit the lamps, and sought to understand the very air that the actors breathed. He was no longer just an artist in service to a duke. He was a philosopher of the physical world, a silent observer of the infinite, preparing his mind for the masterpieces that would soon define the height of the Renaissance. The fog of Milan might have obscured the horizon, but for Leonardo, the path ahead was illuminated by the steady, unwavering light of reason and the endless curiosity of a soul that refused to sleep. Within the silent, cool interior of a refectory at the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, the scent of damp plaster and linseed oil hangs heavy in the air. Leonardo stands upon a high wooden scaffold, his eyes fixed on a wall that is, for the moment, a vast expanse of expectant white. He does not hold a brush. Instead, he stands perfectly still for hours, his arms folded, staring at the empty space as if he can see the figures already moving within the grain of the stone. To the monks who shuffle quietly below, he must seem like a man lost in a waking dream, a sorcerer conjuring spirits from the silence. But in his mind, he is calculating the intersection of the divine and the mathematical, seeking a way to freeze a single shattering moment of human emotion within the rigid, perfect laws of sacred geometry. For Leonardo, a religious commission was never merely an act of piety or a decorative duty. It was a profound philosophical inquiry into the structure of the universe and the place of humanity within it. He believed that the proportions of the human body reflected the proportions of the cosmos, and that a painting should be a window into the very mechanics of the soul. As he began work on what would become the Last Supper, he sought to move beyond the static, iconographic depictions of the past. He wanted to capture the moti mentali, the motions of the mind. He understood that every thought, every surge of fear, every flicker of doubt manifests as a physical ripple upon the body, a twitch of a finger, a tilt of the head, or a tightening of the brow. The composition he envisioned was anchored in the absolute stability of the triangle, a shape he considered a fundamental building block of reality. At the center of the long table sits Christ, his figure forming an equilateral triangle that provides a calm, unshakable axis amidst the storm of human reaction surrounding him. From this central point, the perspective lines of the room, the tapestries on the walls, the coffers of the ceiling, all converge with mathematical precision at his head. It is a world designed to draw the eye inward toward the stillness at the heart of the chaos. Leonardo was using the science of optics to create a sense of spiritual inevitability, a feeling that the space itself is bowing toward the divine presence in its midst. But Leonardo, ever the restless innovator, could not be satisfied with the traditional methods of fresco painting. The standard technique of the time, buon fresco, required the artist to work quickly on wet plaster, finishing a section before it dried. This demanded a decisiveness that was foreign to Leonardo's soul. He was a man of revisions, of slow, meditative layers, a painter who needed to walk away for days and return with a single perfect stroke of shadow. And so he chose to experiment, treating the stone wall like a wooden panel. He applied a thick base of lead white and tempera, intending to create a surface that would allow for the same luminous depth and smoky transitions, the sfumato, that he achieved in his oil paintings. As the weeks turned into months, the monks became accustomed to his unorthodox rhythm. Some days he would arrive at dawn and work until the sun dipped below the horizon, never stopping to eat or drink, his hand moving with a feverish, rhythmic grace. On other days, he would walk across the entire city of Milan, driven by a sudden thought, only to climb the scaffold, add one tiny touch of colour to a sleeve or a hand, and then immediately depart. He was searching for the faces of the apostles in the streets of the city, observing the way a merchant expressed surprise or how a beggar leaned into a conversation. He sought the authentic weight of human experience, refusing to paint a single gesture that did not feel as though it had been pulled from the living, breathing world. In the figures of the 12 apostles, we see the full spectrum of human psychology laid bare. When the announcement of the betrayal is made, the table erupts in a wave of motion that flows outward from the center and then recoils back. There is the sharp, defensive recoil of Peter, the soft, grieving tilt of John's head, and the dark, shadowed tension of Judas, who alone is pulled back from the light, clutching his small bag of silver. Leonardo spent an eternity on these hands, hands that point, hands that plead, hands that rest nervously upon the table. He knew that the hands often speak more truthfully than the face, revealing the hidden tremors of the heart when the voice fails. The process was slow, almost painfully so, for those who awaited the finished work. The Duke's officials fretted over the delays, but Leonardo remained unmoved by their impatience. To him, the painting was a living thing that needed time to grow, to breathe, and to settle into its final form. He would spend hours in the refectory just listening to the silence of the room, ensuring that the light in the painting matched the natural light that fell through the high windows of the hall. He wanted the boundary between the real world and the painted world to dissolve, so that the monks, as they ate their silent meals, would feel as though they were sitting at the very edge of that sacred table, sharing in the quiet, heavy atmosphere of that final evening. This was the height of his powers, a moment where his scientific understanding of light and shadow met his deep, intuitive grasp of human emotion. He used the geometry of the room to create a sense of infinite space, making the walls seem to disappear into a distant, hazy landscape of blue mountains and pale skies. This was the world as he saw it, not a collection of hard edges and bright colors, but a realm of soft transitions, where everything is connected by the invisible currents of the air. The figures are not merely painted onto the wall, they seem to emerge from it, draped in heavy, tactile fabrics that catch the dim light of the refectory with a soft velvet glow. Yet even as the masterpiece neared completion, the very experiment that allowed for such beauty began to show its frailty. The dampness of the convent walls and the experimental nature of his pigments meant that the painting was delicate, almost ethereal, from the moment it was finished. But perhaps there is a certain poetic truth in this fragility. Leonardo understood better than anyone that life is a series of fleeting moments, a constant state of becoming and dissolving. By capturing the motions of the mind in a medium that was itself sensitive to the passage of time, he created something that felt profoundly mortal, a reflection of the human condition in all its brilliance and its inevitable decay. As the sun sets over the red-tiled roofs of Milan, casting long amber shadows across the courtyard of Santa Maria delle Grazie, one can almost imagine Leonardo stepping down from his scaffold for the final time. He would have wiped his brushes with a slow, deliberate care, looking back at the wall one last time before fading into the twilight. The work was done, but his mind was already drifting toward new mysteries, toward the flight of birds, the flow of water, and the hidden anatomy of the world that lay just beyond the reach of the eye. He left behind a room transformed, a space where the sacred and the scientific had finally become one, held together by the quiet, enduring power of a single perfect perspective. The smell of damp earth and the rhythmic sound of a horse's hooves on a winding mountain path often provided Leonardo with more clarity than the quietest studio in Milan. He found that the mind, much like a river, required movement to remain clear, and as the 16th century dawned, his path led him away from the stillness of the fresco and into the dusty, high-stakes world of the fortress and the frontier. In the summer of 1502, Leonardo entered the service of Cesare Borgia, a man of cold ambition and relentless energy, who sought to reshape the map of Italy through sheer force of will. For Leonardo, this was not merely a change in patronage, but an invitation to look at the earth itself as a machine, a vast and complex system that could be measured, mastered, and perhaps even redirected. As he travelled through the rugged landscapes of the Romagna, Leonardo did not see the world as a traditional artist might, seeking only beauty in the light upon the hills. Instead, he looked at the land with the analytical gaze of a surgeon. He carried with him a compass and a specialized odometer of his own design, tracking every curve of the road and every elevation of the ridge. It was during this time that he created his revolutionary plan of Imola, a map that changed the way humanity visualized the ground beneath its feet. Rather than the stylized bird's-eye views common to the era, which often distorted distances for the sake of aesthetics, Leonardo produced an iconographic map, a precise, top-down projection that felt as though he had hovered high above the city, stripping away the clouds to reveal the geometric truth of its streets and walls. There is a quiet, meditative power in this map, with its delicate washes of colour and its mathematical certainty, representing a moment where the chaos of a medieval city was finally tamed by the order of a modern mind. Yet even as he charted the stillness of the earth, his imagination was preoccupied with the violent mechanics of defence and the terrifying potential of motion. In the quiet hours of the night, by the flickering light of a single candle, Leonardo filled his notebooks with designs that seemed to belong to a future centuries away. He sketched heavy turtle-shelled wagons reinforced with metal plates, precursors to the modern tank designed to scatter infantry and protect those within from the sting of arrows. He drew massive, multi-barreled cannons that fanned out like the feathers of a peacock, and giant crossbows that required the strength of a dozen men to cock. There is a profound tension in these pages, a soft internal conflict that hums beneath the surface of the ink. Leonardo often described war as a pazzia bestialissima, a most beastly madness, and his deep love for all living things often led him to buy caged birds in the marketplace just to set them free. And yet, he could not stop his mind from solving the puzzles of destruction. He viewed these machines as exercises in pure geometry and physics, treating the trajectory of a stone or the impact of a bolt as a problem of energy and resistance, separate from the human cost of their use. This fascination with the invisible forces of nature naturally led him back to his oldest obsession, the element of water. To Leonardo, water was the vital humour of the terrestrial body, moving through the valleys like blood through a vein. He spent weeks observing the way a stream curled around a rock, noting how the bubbles spiraled in miniature galaxies of foam. He realized that if one could understand the laws of the vortex, one could control the very lifeblood of a kingdom. He proposed ambitious hydraulic systems to divert the river Arno, dreaming of a canal that would bypass the city of Pisa and provide Florence with a direct route to the sea. He drew elaborate diagrams of sluice gates, dams, and excavating machines, imagining a world where the landscape was not a fixed inheritance, but a fluid medium that could be sculpted to suit the needs of civilization. He saw the river not as an obstacle, but as a source of infinite power, a clockwork mechanism driven by gravity and the sun, waiting for a human hand to guide its flow. As he worked on these earthly problems, his eyes were frequently drawn upward, following the effortless glide of a hawk or the frantic beating of a dragonfly's wings. If man could master the water and the earth, why then should the air remain a sanctuary? The dream of flight was perhaps the most enduring thread in the tapestry of his life, a soft, persistent whisper that never quite left him. He studied the anatomy of wings with the same rigour he applied to the human arm, sketching the delicate tendons and the lightness of the bone. He designed the great bird, an ornithopter with vast, bat-like wings made of starched silk and fustian, intended to be powered by the rhythmic pumping of a pilot's legs. He even conceptualized an aerial screw, a precursor to the helicopter, imagining a blade of linen that would bore through the air like a screw through wood if turned with enough velocity. There is something deeply moving about these drawings, the way the lines of the machine mimic the organic curves of the natural world, as if Leonardo believed that by imitating the shape of a bird, he could inherit its spirit. But the more he studied the mechanics of flight, the more he began to understand the immense weight of the atmosphere and the limitations of human muscle. He realized that the air was a fluid, much like water, and that to move through it required a delicate balance of lift and drag. His focus shifted from the frantic flapping of wings to the quiet, subtle art of gliding. He watched how birds used the rising currents of warm air to spiral upward without a single beat of their wings, and he began to design gliders that relied on the wind itself for power. In these sketches we see the true engineer emerging, a man who understood that the secret to mastery was not to fight against nature, but to listen to its rules and move in harmony with them. The tension between his role as a military engineer and his identity as a lover of life seemed to resolve itself in these heights. In the sky, there were no borders to defend, no cities to besiege, only the vast, silent expanse of the blue and the endless possibility of a new perspective. As the years in the service of the Borgias drew to a close, Leonardo carried these lessons back with him to the quiet of his studio. He had seen the world from the heights of the mountains and the depths of the trenches, and he had learned that everything, from the flow of a river to the flight of a bird to the trajectory of a cannonball, was governed by the same universal laws of proportion and force. He had become a master of the tangible world, an architect of both peace and war, yet he remained a wanderer at heart. The machines he built and the maps he drew were merely tools to help him understand the deeper, underlying patterns of existence. He began to see that the engineering of the world was not just about stone and steel, but about the way light moved through the atmosphere and the way time eroded the mountains. The movement of his life was slowing now, settling into a more contemplative rhythm. The frantic energy of the military camps was replaced by the steady, focused observation of the natural philosopher. He returned to his notebooks, refining his theories on optics, on the way the eye perceives distance through the blurring of edges and the cooling of colors. He realized that the engineer and the artist were not two different men, but two sides of the same coin, one seeking to harness the world, the other seeking to reflect it. And as he sat by the window, watching the dust motes dance in a beam of afternoon light, he began to turn his attention back to the human form, not as a machine of war, but as a vessel of the soul, a landscape of bone and spirit that held more mysteries than any map could ever hope to contain. The engineer was ready to become a poet once more, but he would bring with him the precision of the compass and the wisdom of the river, prepared to embark on the most profound exploration of all, the study of the life that pulsed beneath the skin. The sound of a horse's hooves on the paving stones of Florence carries a different resonance than the heavy thud of boots on the dusty roads of a war camp. For Leonardo, returning to the city of his youth in the year 1503, felt like stepping into a familiar dream that had somehow changed its cadence while he was away. The air in the city was thick with the scent of lilies and wood smoke, and the streets were alive with a new, restless energy. Florence was no longer the playground of the Medici, but a republic struggling to define its soul, and the artistic landscape had grown crowded with younger, hungrier men who looked upon the aging master with a mixture of reverence and quiet challenge. Chief among these newcomers was a young man named Michelangelo Buonarroti, a sculptor of immense volcanic talent whose temperament was as jagged and uncompromising as the marble he carved. Where Leonardo was elegant, soft-spoken, and moved through the world with a graceful detachment, Michelangelo was brooding, dusty, and consumed by a fierce, almost painful piety. Their rivalry became the talk of the workshops and the piazzas, a clash of two diametrically opposed philosophies. Michelangelo believed the soul was trapped within the stone, waiting to be liberated by the forceful strike of a chisel, while Leonardo believed the world was a series of delicate veils, a mystery to be coaxed out through observation and the gentle layering of pigment. They would pass each other in the street, the elder statesman of art in his rose-coloured tunics, and the young Titan with the broken nose, and the air between them would crackle with a silent, heavy tension that defined the high noon of the Renaissance. Yet despite the pressures of competition and the demands of the Florentine government, Leonardo found himself drawn to a small, private commission that would eventually become the most famous face in the history of human consciousness. He began to paint the portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. In the quiet of his studio, away from the clamour of the great council hall, he started a work that he would never truly finish, carrying it with him for the rest of his life like a sacred talisman. To look at the Mona Lisa is to witness the perfection of sfumato, a technique Leonardo described as without lines or borders in the manner of smoke. He applied the paint in glazes so thin they were almost microscopic, layering them one over another until the transitions between light and shadow became imperceptible to the human eye. There are no hard edges on her face. The corners of her mouth and the contours of her eyes dissolve into the surrounding skin, creating an expression that seems to shift and change depending on how the light catches the panel. It is a living, breathing thing, a synthesis of everything he had learned about the behavior of light, the optics of the eye, and the subtle movements of the human spirit. As he worked on the portrait, Leonardo's curiosity pulled him deeper into the physical reality of what lay beneath that enigmatic smile. He began to spend his nights in the basement of the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, a place of hushed whispers and flickering candlelight. There, in the cool, damp air of the mortuary, he performed meticulous dissections of the human body, driven by a desire to understand the mechanics of life with the same precision he had once used to map the flow of a river. He was no longer content to simply paint the surface of a limb. He needed to know how the tendons pulled, how the muscles overlapped, and how the heart, that wonderful instrument, pumped the spirit of life through the intricate network of the veins. Imagine him there, in the silence of the hospital, his sleeves rolled up, his notebook open on a nearby bench. The scratching of his quill was the only sound in the room as he recorded the delicate structures of the hand or the complex curvature of the spine. He was the first to accurately describe the 4 chambers of the heart, and the first to suggest that the eye perceives the world upside down before the brain corrects the image. This was not merely a scientific pursuit. For Leonardo, it was a form of worship. To understand the anatomy of a man was to understand the architecture of the universe itself. He saw the same patterns in the branching of the bronchial tubes as he did in the branching of a tree, and the same spirals in the valves of the heart as he did in the eddies of a mountain stream. This synthesis of art and science reached a profound peak during these years in Florence. He was realizing that the beauty of the human form was not an accident of aesthetics, but a masterpiece of engineering. When he returned to the portrait of Lisa in the mornings, his hand was guided by the knowledge of the nerves that controlled the flicker of a smile and the bone structure that gave the brow its quiet strength. He was painting more than a woman. He was painting the very concept of being. The landscape behind her, with its winding paths and jagged peaks, was not a specific place, but a primordial earth in the process of becoming, a world of water and stone that mirrored the fluid nature of the human soul. The citizens of Florence might have seen a man who struggled to complete his commissions, a dreamer who spent too much time watching birds or sketching the flow of the Arno. They saw a rival to Michelangelo, who seemed more interested in the why of a thing than the what. But Leonardo was operating on a different timeline, one measured not by the deadlines of patrons, but by the slow, steady pulse of discovery. He was building a bridge between the seen and the unseen, between the cold facts of the laboratory and the warm glow of the canvas. As the years in Florence stretched on, his notebooks became a sprawling cathedral of ideas. Thousands of pages filled with mirror writing and silver point sketches. He studied the flight of dragonflies and the way a drop of water shatters upon a surface, finding in each small movement a universal law. He was searching for the soul of the world, that invisible force that animated the dust and the stars alike. And in the quiet gaze of the Mona Lisa, he found a way to let that soul speak without words. The painting became a mirror of his own mind, deep, layered, and infinitely complex, containing both the stillness of the mountain and the restless energy of the sea. The rivalry with Michelangelo eventually faded into the background as Leonardo's reputation as a sage and a philosopher-artist grew. He was no longer just a painter of the Renaissance. He was becoming the Renaissance personified, a man who refused to see any boundary between the beauty of a flower and the mathematics of its growth. He moved through the streets of Florence like a ghost from a future century, his long grey beard flowing over his chest, his eyes always looking upward or inward, searching for the next secret that nature was ready to whisper. The hospital of Santa Maria Nuova remained his sanctuary of truth, where the physical reality of death provided the ultimate lessons on the vitality of life. Each muscle he mapped and each nerve he traced was a testament to his belief that the sun does not move, a cryptic note he wrote in his journals that hinted at a cosmic understanding far beyond his time. He was preparing himself for a final journey, one that would take him away from the familiar hills of Tuscany toward the grand courts of kings, but he would take the lessons of Florence with him. He would take the memory of the light on the Arno, the weight of the marble in the workshops, and the unfinished smile of a woman who seemed to know something that the rest of the world had yet to discover. And so, the master continued his work, his brush moving with the lightness of a breath, his mind soaring through the heavens, even as his hands remained rooted in the earth. The city of Florence, with all its noise and its rivalries, was merely the stage upon which he performed his greatest act. The act of seeing the world exactly as it was, and in doing so, revealing it as it had never been seen before. The shadows deepened in the corners of his studio, but the light on the canvas remained, a soft, eternal glow that promised that even in the darkness of the night there is a beauty that never fades, a mystery that never truly ends. The smell of cedar wood and old vellum fills the air of a quiet room, where the only sound is the rhythmic scratching of a silver point pen against paper. It is late in the year 1516, and the restless wanderer has finally found a place where the wind does not pull at his cloak with such urgency. Leonardo is 64 years old now, his beard a silver waterfall that cascades down his chest, and his hands, though still capable of the most delicate observations, have begun to feel the weight of the many decades spent reaching for the impossible. Across the Alps, a young and energetic King Francis I has extended an invitation that feels less like a contract and more like a sanctuary. The King of France does not ask for fortresses or weapons. He asks only for the pleasure of Leonardo's conversation, for the privilege of being near a mind that encompasses the entire world. And so, with his most precious possessions packed into leather trunks, including the portrait of a smiling woman and the notebooks that hold the secrets of the birds, Leonardo begins his final journey toward the Loire Valley. The journey is slow, a gentle passage through landscapes that seem to mirror the softness of his own late paintings. As the carriage moves through the French countryside, the sharp, jagged peaks of the Italian mountains give way to the rolling green hills and the silver ribbons of the rivers that define the heart of France. He arrives at the chateau of Clos-Lucé, a manor of warm red brick and white tufa stone, connected by a secret underground tunnel to the royal castle of Amboise. Here he is given the title of Premier Painter, engineer and architect to the king, a distinction that carries no heavy burden of labour, but rather the freedom to simply exist as a sage. The king calls him father and visits him often, sitting by his side for hours to listen to the old master speak of the mechanics of the soul and the geometry of the universe. In these moments, the boundaries between monarch and artist dissolve, leaving only two men lost in the vastness of human inquiry. The atmosphere at Clos-Lucé is one of profound peace, a stillness that allows the mind to turn inward. The gardens are filled with the scent of lavender and roses, and the light that filters through the tall windows is diffused and golden, casting long, soft shadows across the floorboards. Leonardo spends his mornings organizing the mountain of notebooks he has accumulated over a lifetime. Thousands of pages, written in his characteristic mirror script, are spread across heavy oak tables. He sifts through sketches of human hearts, diagrams of hydraulic pumps, and studies of the way water curls around an obstacle in a stream. It is a monumental task, this attempt to bring order to a life's work that was always more about the process of discovery than the finality of a finished product. He realizes, perhaps with a quiet smile, that his true legacy is not a collection of statues or buildings, but this restless, beautiful record of a mind that never learned how to stop asking why. As he looks out over the Loire, he finds himself drawn once again to the power of water, but his late reflections take on a more sombre, apocalyptic tone. He begins a series of drawings known as the deluge. These are not the gentle ripples of his youth, but visions of cataclysmic storms, where the sky and the earth merge in a chaotic dance of destruction. He watches the clouds gather over the French valley and imagines the sheer force of nature reclaiming all that man has built. Yet even in these visions of the end, there is a meticulous beauty. He renders the swirling winds and crashing waves with the same mathematical precision he once used to map the muscles of an arm. It is as if, in his final years, he is making peace with the transience of all things, acknowledging that the same energy that creates life eventually dissolves it back into the elements. The shadows on the paper are deep, but the hand that guides the pen remains steady, finding a strange, quiet harmony in the face of the infinite. The evenings in Amboise are long and cool, the air thick with the damp sweetness of the river. Leonardo often sits by the window, watching the swallows dart through the twilight, their movements a living testament to the laws of flight he spent years trying to decode. He thinks of the mountains of his childhood, the blue peaks of Vinci that first taught him how to look at the horizon. He is far from home, yet he feels a sense of belonging that eluded him in the bustling streets of Rome or Milan. Here, in the quiet embrace of the French court, he is finally allowed to be weary. He reflects on the nature of time, writing in his notebook that just as a well-spent day brings sweet sleep, so a life well used brings a sweet death. The anxiety of unfinished projects seems to melt away in the soft light of the Loire, replaced by a deep, meditative gratitude for the sheer act of perception. He continues to work, of course, for a mind like his cannot truly rest until the very end. He designs a mechanical lion for the king, a marvel of clockwork that can walk and open its chest to reveal a cluster of lilies. It is a toy, a whim, but it is executed with the same genius that once imagined flying machines and armored tanks. He also continues to refine his paintings, adding microscopic layers of glaze to the shadows of the Saint Anne or the mysterious gaze of the Saint John the Baptist. These works become his companions, their faces familiar and comforting in the dimming light of his studio. He is no longer painting for patrons or for fame. He is painting for the sake of the light itself, trying to capture that precise moment where a form emerges from the darkness and becomes part of the world. In the quiet hours of the night, when the castle is silent and the stars are bright over the valley, Leonardo listens to the heartbeat of the world. He understands now that everything is connected, the flow of blood in the veins, the flow of water in the earth, and the flow of stars in the firmament. He has spent his life breaking the world down into its smallest parts, only to find that it is a single, breathing whole. The notebooks are nearly full, the ink is running low, and the fire in the hearth is a soft, pulsing red. There is no fear in this stillness, only a profound curiosity about what lies beyond the final shadow. He has mapped the visible world with a clarity that no one else has ever achieved, and now he prepares to step into the invisible, leaving behind a trail of light for all those who will follow in his footsteps. The gardens of Clos Lucé are silvered by the moon, the trees standing like silent sentinels over the sleeping master. The air is still, holding its breath as the great mind begins its final descent into repose. Every observation, every sketch, and every thought has been a prayer to the beauty of existence. As the candles flicker and burn down to their wicks, the legacy of the Renaissance man remains etched into the very fabric of history, not as a collection of cold facts, but as a living, breathing invitation to look closer, to wonder longer, and to find the extraordinary in the ordinary. The river continues its journey toward the sea, constant and unchanging, much like the spirit of the man who spent his final breaths trying to understand the music of its flow. The ink on the final pages of his notebooks was barely dry when the great silent migration of his thoughts began. Leonardo had bequeathed his life's work, thousands of loose sheets, sketches, and observations, to his loyal pupil, Francesco Melzi, who carried these treasures back to a villa in Vaprio d'Adda. For a time, they remained a cohesive library of wonders, a sanctuary of paper where the flight of birds and the mechanics of the human heart lived side by side in the shadows of a quiet study. But as the decades stretched into centuries, the vast ocean of his mind became a series of scattered islands. The codices were separated, sold, hidden in private collections, and occasionally lost to the dust of history, waiting like dormant seeds for a more enlightened age to rediscover them. As the years passed, the world began to realize that the fragments Leonardo left behind were more than just artistic studies. They were a blueprint for a future he would never see. These notebooks, written in his rhythmic, mirrored script, were a testament to a mind that refused to be contained by the boundaries of a single discipline. When scholars finally began to reassemble the pieces of his legacy in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found the foundations of modern anatomy, the precursors to the helicopter and the tank, and a profound understanding of geology that predated the formal science by hundreds of years. The rediscovery of the codices was like hearing a voice from a distant mountain, clear and resonant, reminding us that curiosity is a flame that can never be truly extinguished. There is a peculiar beauty in the fact that so many of Leonardo's grandest projects remained unfinished, existing only as dreams captured in silver point and chalk. The great bronze horse for the Sforza family, the colossal canal systems, the massive murals that decayed even as he painted them, these failures were, in truth, invitations. They influenced centuries of thinkers, not by providing final answers, but by demonstrating the infinite scale of the questions. Architects looked at his sketches of ideal cities and saw the breadth of urban planning. Engineers looked at his gears and pulleys and saw the skeleton of the industrial world. His unfinished works act as a bridge, stretching across the ages, inviting every generation to pick up the brush or the compass and continue the work of understanding the universe. We often speak of the Renaissance man as a singular archetype, a figure who stands at the crossroads of history. Leonardo was the embodiment of this transition, acting as a gentle hand that guided humanity out of the rigid structures of the medieval world and into the light of the modern era. He did not see a conflict between the spiritual and the empirical, between the grace of an angel's wing and the mathematical precision of a bird's flight. To him, they were two notes in the same chord. He showed us that to be truly modern is to be deeply observant, to realize that the same laws of proportion that govern the petals of a flower also govern the stars in their orbits. He taught us that art is a science and science is an art, and that the most profound wisdom is found in the synthesis of the two. The legacy of the universal man is not found in the museums of the world alone, though his masterpieces certainly draw the gaze of millions. His true legacy is a way of seeing. It is the quiet realization that occurs when we look at the ripples in a pond and recognize the same patterns in the clouds above or the hair of a child. It is the understanding that everything in this world is connected by invisible threads of light and logic. As the night air grows cool and the world around you settles into a deep, rhythmic stillness, you might imagine Leonardo sitting by a window in the late evening, watching the shadow of a leaf dance against the stone wall. He would not have seen it as a simple shadow, but as a complex interplay of optics, time, and the very essence of existence. In these final, quiet moments of reflection, we can find comfort in the interconnectedness that Leonardo so dearly loved. He believed that the earth was a living body, with the rivers as its veins and the mountains as its bones. He saw himself not as a master of nature, but as a humble student of its infinite complexity. This perspective offers a soothing sense of belonging, a reminder that we are not separate from the world, but an integral part of its unfolding story. Like the esfumato technique he perfected, the boundaries between the self and the universe begin to soften, blurring into a peaceful, unified whole. The mind of the Renaissance was a mind that never stopped wondering, never stopped asking why, and never stopped finding wonder in the smallest details of the mundane. It is a mind that invites us to rest now, knowing that the world is full of mysteries that are both vast and intimate. The great river of his thought continues to flow, winding through the landscapes of our collective memory, carrying with it the wisdom of the past and the possibilities of the future. As the light fades and the silence deepens, the spirit of Leonardo remains a steady, guiding star, shining with the soft glow of 1,000 sketches and the enduring warmth of a heart that loved the world enough to try and understand it all. And so, we let the pages of history turn slowly, one by one, until they come to rest. The ink has faded to a gentle amber, and the vellum is soft as a whisper. The work is never truly finished, for the journey of discovery is eternal. But for now, the tools are laid aside, the candles are extinguished, and the great mind finds its peace in the quiet harmony of the night. Everything is connected. Everything is part of the great, slow dance of life, and in that realization, there is a profound and lasting rest.